Hello and welcome to the Hardy Woods Podcast. I'm your host, Colin Fraser, and today's show is going to be all about bobwhite quail and the landscapes that it calls home. Quail are highly sought after by hunters, and they're an icon of rural life in the South. Quail are special. They hold a unique place in Southerners' hearts, and quail hunting has inspired some remarkable achievements in conservation. But the gentleman's game bird is in trouble in most of its native range. Populations have declined precipitously in recent decades, and quail are entirely extirpated from several states in the east. Like a lot of issues around wildlife conservation, the decline of bobwhite quail is mostly caused by habitat loss. Here to speak with us today about quail and quail habitat is Cathryn McVicker. Cathryn's a biologist for Quail Forever. It's a nonprofit organization whose mission is to help restore quail to the landscape and create and restore habitat to sustain them. Cathryn, thank you for coming.
Thanks for having me.
Katie, can you tell us a little bit more about the organization and its mission?
Yeah, so Quail Forever was established in 2005, and it's actually a branch organization off of a larger nonprofit called Pheasants Forever, which was established in 1982. And really the point of Pheasants Forever was that some hunters noticed there was a correlation between the disappearance of upland game habitat and declining pheasant populations. So they created Pheasants Forever to really promote habitat conservation so that they could continue hunting. Here, further east in the U.S., we don't really have pheasant populations, but quail are still a very important game bird, and they require that same upland habitat. So Quail Forever is doing the exact same thing Pheasants Forever is doing. Legally we're the same organization. We just focus it more on the East Coast as a quail focused habitat.
Okay, so one of the things I want to talk about, while I've got you, is about quail in particular, because like you mentioned, there's been pretty precipitous decline. We talked about that. I mean, that's kind of always what comes up. But can we talk about the bird itself? Just appearance and their life cycle, eating, nesting. Like, what do they do? And
Sure.
why?
Yeah, so quail are not a small bird, but they're not massive. They're kind of between the size of a robin and a crow. And they're these really pretty colored birds. The males have white stripes on their face, like a white and black stripe pattern. It's really striking. And then the body feathers are kind of this rufous browny pattern. They essentially look like leaves on the ground. So that's kind of the look of a quail. There's different kinds of quail. That one's specifically bobwhite quail because that's what I have in my area. And so we usually see coveys of quail, and that's groups of quail that are together and they travel around and they'll feed and they'll nest in these groups called coveys. Quail are ground nesting birds, so they make their nests on the ground. And that's why it's really important to have the right vegetation on the ground for them to nest in and also to eat. So quail eat primarily seeds, and they'll also eat insects, berries, and plant matter.
Yeah, so when we talk about quail forever, like again, the decline of quail, which is the primary mission of Quail Forever is turning that around. So what was the historic range of bobwhite quail, and where are they strongest now on the landscape?
So quail historically were found across the southeast of the U.S. and even down into the Yucatan of Mexico. So we'll see that. I mean, we would expect to see them anywhere from like Texas up to states like Illinois and then over to Virginia and back down to Florida. So that kind of that southeast section of the U.S. We still have remnant populations of them across this range, but they're really just not in the same numbers as they historically were. We see the best populations further west. The eastern populations are really struggling, but like I said, in that further western region or even down south more is really where we see the most bounce back. But we're bringing more work from Quail Forever up east to try and expand that range back to what it used to be.
Yeah, I remember seeing them growing up in the South. There were still quail, you'd flush them out of a ditch kind of, and you get that covey pop up. And then also seeing them in California.
Yeah, yeah.
I've got some
So
family out there, and so and they have the funny thing on their head. They're like California quail. I don't know if you're familiar with them, but um, they seemed fine. They were doing really well, and it's really remarkable what we've seen with the decline in the southeast. Um, and talking about that, not to be all doom and gloom, but talking about it, it's all about successional habitat. Um, you and I have talked about that off air a fair amount. Um, but maybe you could explain to people like what successional habitat is, how it's created, and why it's important. Because I really think that's, pretty key to what we're talking about.
Yeah, and so I guess I'll just go ahead and specify that there are a lot of different species of quail. Specifically, I'm in Virginia, so I'm working mostly with the northern bobwhite quail. But you do have, like you said, there's the California quail, and then you also have mountain quail, Gambel's quail, the scaled quail, and Mearns quail. And they're not all found across the country. They do have their own individual habitats and ranges, but they're all going to benefit from that early successional habitat. And really what early successional habitat is it's young growth. So we're looking at the shrubby layer that comes up into newly disturbed areas, the grasses and the forbs that'll come up as well. And so really the key is disturbance in these early successional areas. And when you disturb the habitat, you promote new growth. And that's what early successional habitat is.
Yeah, and just for anyone that's listening, when we're talking about young growth, we're talking about young plants. Um, and that's something I'm familiar with as a hunter and as someone who deals with the woods a little bit. But it's when sunlight hits the ground, right?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. That's exactly right. You allow those babies, your seed bank and all the baby plants in there a chance to grow up. And that's what provides the habitat.
Speaking of babies, I think that one of the biggest things that I've read about for people that are interested in both quail and turkeys and all kinds of other uh, game birds, the entomological community is a big part of it, right? Like I know those chicks are really carnivorous when they're young, right? I mean,
Yeah.
that's like a big, yeah,
Yeah, so baby chicks or baby quail, the chicks and the adults don't have the same diet. And so that's a big issue when people are trying to create quail habitat. So the adults, as I previously said, will eat a lot of insects and berries and plant matter. But when they're first born as young chicks, they're primarily eating insects. And so you need to have habitat that we call it bugging habitat. And so another way to think about it would be like pollinator habitat, areas where you're going to get a lot of insects from flowering plants and forbs. And that's really what quail need so that they can feed their babies.
I think that's so interesting because they're like, looking at, and we're going to get into like land use practices coming up here, but I think that's so interesting to think about things being buggier or maybe just more biodiverse. Um, because you look at those like early successional communities or even like decaying wood and stuff like that. And like that's where that high protein load comes in. Because those little birds they have to grow up pretty fast, right? I mean, they're born around now, I would think.
Yeah,
Here
it's
we're
about
recording in first week of May.
yeah, we're starting the nesting season now.
Right. And they've got to be grown up quail by the fall.
Yep. Yeah,
So they have like tremendous protein needs, I would think.
and what's really cool about quail chicks is that they're actually born ready to go. They're not like a lot of other bird chicks that are helpless and need to be fed for a long time. Quail chicks are pretty much ready to go. They can walk around. They have their eyes open. And so the adults are able to lead them into these bugging habitats and they can start feeding for themselves.
Yeah. So we kind of like we talked about what that early successional habitat looks like, disturbance, entomological communities, and like all the kind of things that they need. But when we look at it, it's declined, right? And I mean, just in my background, I was a before I got into forestry, I was a farm manager, and so I know how land use practices have changed, but you're a biologist. And so can you tell us a little bit about why that successional habitat has declined?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because in a lot of ways it has nothing to do with biology. Um, Early successional habitat was very dependent on natural disturbance. And so that really was disturbance that we saw through wildfires or really catastrophic storms that would completely wipe out older growth forests. And then when you wipe those out, you have this opening, and that's where your early successional habitat comes up. Now, because of society values and, what we see as nature and the way that we've suppressed a lot of these natural disturbances, such as wildfire, it has just allowed the old growth to continue growing. And so it's really bringing back that disturbance. It's why we promote a lot of prescribed burning, because we do so much to prevent wildfires now that we have to reintroduce these types of disturbances. So although, you're changing the biology of a lot of these ecosystems, it's really just because of the human interaction with it that we've lost a lot of the habitat.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's so interesting because, like, a little bit of stuff I've read about, we really uh, have a strange relationship sometimes with forest management specifically about that. And really well-meaning people will, want to leave the trees alone, which is good, leave the forest a forest, but it's, it has contributed to a decline in some of that successional habitat. And
Yeah. And I think it's important, like trees are important. No one's here to say that trees are not important. But it's about having a mosaic of habitats as well and continuing the recycling of habitats to always have habitat going through the stages of its life from early successional to old growth. And I think that we've placed a lot of cultural importance on forests, and because of that, some of our other habitats have kind of been pushed to the back burner. So we're really trying to re-promote the idea of grasslands and that early habitat in the work that we do at Quail Forever and Pheasants Forever.
yeah, so I made a note about that. And one of my favorite things, every time I talk to someone who's interested in ground nesting birds, and you and I have talked about this before, but it's what we call the softball test.
Yeah.
Um, which is like what makes good quail habitat. And you have to, that's why we started with the discussion of like, what does a quail look like? How big is he? Like, how big are the chicks? All of those things. And you can explain the softball test, but I think it's like a good way for people to understand what early successional habitat looks like.
Yeah. So just to recap, quail are about the size of a softball, and that's why we call it the softball test. And the chicks are about the size of a golf ball when they're born, maybe a little bit smaller. But we use the softball test because it's a great way to actually see if the habitat we need can cover a quail. So if you take a softball and you roll it on the ground, you want it to keep rolling. You don't want it to get stuck in any thick vegetation, but you don't want to necessarily be able to see the softball. So that becomes a balance between vegetation and bare ground. The other thing that you can do with the softball test is if you throw a softball, you want there to be some kind of vegetative cover within the distance that you're able to throw a softball. So if I'm standing out in a grass field, which is important for quail, a native warm season grass field, I want to be able to throw that softball to an island or some kind of thicket of vegetation to provide cover. And if I can't throw a softball to a covered area like that, then there's not enough shrubby layer to cover the quail.
So I was never an athlete, but is that an underhand or an overhand throw?
Overhand, we're talking here probably about like 100 feet or 1 to 200 feet, which is pretty far. But quail, if you flush quail, they can fly about 200 feet. Flying takes a lot of energy for them. So after like the third or fourth time you flush them, they're really going to start to run out of steam. And so that's kind of why we use this analogy of if you can imagine throwing a softball, that's about as far as a quail is going to flush to cover.
That's good. I think that's really useful for people to look at. Like, I was speaking to one of your coworkers a while back, and he described that, nature looks messy, and I think that sometimes that gets understood not as well by people that expect things to look really, really orderly, where really it's like the more biodiverse plant communities and insect communities and great and like nesting habitat for like all kinds of animal babies, really.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it kind of goes back to that cultural importance we place on forests. People have this idea of what they think nature is and what it should be. And that's
Hmm.
not necessarily how it actually is or historically was. And so kind of changing that mindset, realizing that there is beauty when something doesn't look beautiful, but it works for nature is really important.
Right, right. And yeah, exactly. And I think it's so interesting that like especially when you look at quail and grouse and woodcock, um, that people that like to hunt them and chase them around are a little bit more sometimes attuned to those transitional habitats. You say, oh goodness, like there's a burn, there's a clear cut, something that maybe doesn't look great at the time is providing quite a good nursery um,
Yeah,
for
exactly.
bringing up those young animals, which is just something I've noticed.
Yeah, it benefits not just quail, but there are so many different species that use habitat like that: the deer, the turkey, the grouse. And then a big point I think that is important to make is you're also promoting bird migration in general with that kind of habitat. And so a lot of our birds that are a focus of conservation depend on early successional habitat, things like yellow-breasted chats, prairie warblers, indigo buntings, field sparrows. Those all need that habitat as well. And so if you provide it, you're helping to facilitate the annual migration that they do every single year.
Yeah, and one of the other ones that I've read about a bunch lately is the golden winged warbler.
Yep, that's a big
I
one.
have a golden winged warbler ornithologist coming on. That's her whole thing.
Oh, cool.
And yeah, we're very excited to talk to her. But it's the same kind of thing. It's an entomological community. It's like a different level of shade. It's a different level. It's a different temperature than it would otherwise be, right?
Hmm.
It's like a little bit warmer, a little bit brighter,
Yep,
and a lot more insect life,
exactly.
right? So it's all kind of part of the same thing. But as much as we talk about the habitat that you guys are working for, I know that y'all are like habitat focused, and I know that you have got an office in an NRCS building. And for our listeners that don't know, it's the Natural Resource Conservation Service, which is the conservation arm of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Um, but if you could like explain to our listenership how a nonprofit like the one that you work for, how do y'all like interface between landowners and these federal programs?
So our job is really to help facilitate bringing landowners in and using the cost share programs that programs like the NRCS has. And so with NRCS, you can get reimbursed a certain amount of money to do certain practices on your land that help to promote there's a few different things. Specifically, as a farm bill biologist with Quail Forever, I'm looking at promoting wildlife habitat on your land. So you can actually get some money back from the federal organizations like NRCS to do these practices on your land.
So that's like a cost share thing. And I'm kind of familiar with it because, you know, running farms and then, various like forestry type things I've done afterwards. I'm a little bit familiar with that kind of stuff, but is there any way you can like explain that a little bit more? Like what practices are you talking about? How does the cost share work?
So there's a ton of practices, and the cost share can be applicable to a wide range of properties. So there's ones that are specifically for agricultural businesses, and then there's ones that, like I said, are specifically for wildlife. A few that I can think of off the top of my head that are really important and we use a lot would be things like forest stand improvement or prescribed burning on your land. But I would encourage anyone who's interested to contact their local NRCS office. We have them all over the country in every state, and they'll be able to tell you more about if you're eligible for any of their programs. And you're going to be looking at programs like EQIP, which is the Environmental Quality Incentive Program, or possibly even a program like CSP, which is the Conservation Stewardship Program. And they have different eligibility requirements and a little bit different contract makeup. So I would encourage anyone interested to talk to their local NRCS office.
Yeah, I've definitely heard about CSP, especially as it relates to forest management. But I think there's one in particular, the forest stand improvement, got the unlovely moniker of Code 666, which is, I think, mid-story removal. Does that sound right?
Yeah, forest stand improvement is generally used. I mean, it depends on the intentions of the landowner, and a lot of the times we do this in collaboration with the Department of Forestry because they're the ones who can make official forest stewardship plans. And so it can be a number of things. You can do like a crop tree release project, or you could just do thinning. So it depends on each individual property.
All right. So the basics of that is that, there are landowner support for people who are attempting to improve wildlife habitat.
Yes, exactly.
Well, I think that's something really important for people to know, because I think these, looking at these kind of habitat issues can be a little bit daunting if people don't realize that there's a way to get around it.
Yeah, and the other thing is like like I said, there are eligibility requirements for the cost share. But if a landowner just wants some technical assistance, if they just want a biologist to go out and essentially give them ideas on what to do with their land, but they're not necessarily looking for the cost share, we're available for that too. We can provide as much technical assistance as you could possibly want.
So just to wrap up, because I'm looking at our time here, we're coming in on our half hour, but one of the things that I keep coming up with, like coming across as I'm reading about this stuff, is that there really is a shortage of good news on quail, right? Like all you read about is the drop in populations or disappearing populations, and I don't think it's just about quail. Like I mean, it's monarch butterflies, it's all of these things that live on that landscape. And what, because you're a young biologist, what do you think is the biggest challenge to bringing these populations back, bringing that biodiversity back?
So I think that there's quite a few challenges. One of those is just lack of knowledge. I don't think people really understand how they should be managing their land or the ways that they can. And so like I said, it goes back to that cultural importance of forests. They're like, oh, forests, that's nature. That's all nature is. I need to keep every single tree, or I need to keep, my lawn perfectly manicured, or anything like that. But really, I think educating, spreading the word that nature, like you said, is messy and isn't only one thing is really important. So helping to increase the knowledge of these other types of habitats. And then I think if you're getting more specifically into actually doing some of the practices we talked about, or putting in like a pollinator meadow or a native warm season grass field, for example, there's really a lack of ability to complete the project itself. We're lacking the personnel that know how to do it, and we're lacking the specialized equipment that you need to do it as well. And so I think that between the lack of knowledge and the lack of resources for implementation, that's really where the struggle comes from.
So, Katie, like you keep bringing up something like really, really interesting. Like I said, nature's messy, and you're like, well, no, it's the pollinator meadows. And with my background, I keep thinking about this thing where, like efficiency being almost the enemy of biodiversity, right? Like as land use migrates toward a monoculture on each piece of ground, and that efficiency in producing food, right, ends up kind of diminishing biodiversity, and there are little birds and bugs that we all love that are struggling.
Yeah, and I think that people may not understand efficiency either, because someone might look at my lawn and say, well, that's the most beautiful way to keep it. It's the easiest way to keep it. It's just grass. I don't have to do anything with it. But you're mowing that once a week, like most people are. With a native meadow, you only really do any disturbance on it once every 3 years. And so if you want to talk about efficiency, I don't know. I think we need to reevaluate our standards a little bit.
I think that I love that. I love that. That's something I've thought too. Is just they're making Virginia look like a golf course may not be the best.
Yeah, and it's going to take a lot of work, because I know that there is kind of that, uh, I'll call it like a Virginia aesthetic. We
Uh-huh.
see a lot of those manicured lawns, and horses are very important here in Virginia, and so it's always the big lawns with the black fence around it, and so it's about changing mindsets for sure, and it's going to be a long process, but I'm hopeful.
Yeah, I have friends that are really into rabbit hunting, and you talk about something that loves successional habitat. Uh, Cottontails love it,
Oh yeah.
um, and they'll actually go on a road trip to go to Amish country because they apparently in Lancaster they don't use weed whackers, so they have messy fence lines.
Hmm.
So the whole thing is a whole bunch of rabbit warrens. Uh, and I imagine that that's got to be good for birds and pollinators and everything else as well. And maybe something we should embrace. I mean, not to tell people what to do, but
Oh, absolutely. That is another practice that you can do too in our programs. We call them hedgerows, and that's basically just promoting a messy fence line. It's one less thing that you have to maintain. It's good for wildlife. So I don't know. It seems like the right answer to me.
yeah, yeah, it is interesting, and it's you know, I think that sometimes people like well-meaning folks maybe just as you said need a little bit more education. Um, but on that note, like, what is there? What's one thing that, assuming that this podcast makes its way to uh, at least a handful of landowners or land managers who are looking to help support these little birds, what would you like to see?
So if we're specifically talking about forests, because I know this is kind of like a forest podcast, I would say the one thing that you could really do to help wildlife is to open up the canopy. Really, if you're talking about bobwhite quail, we're looking at like a 30 to 50 basal area, but any light that you can get to the forest floor is going to really help promote that early successional habitat we're looking for. So if there was one thing that you could do in your forested land, I would say to just open that canopy and thin it out a little bit, let the light in.
Well, Catherine, thank you so much for coming on today. I appreciate you talking about bobwhite quail and the effort to bring them back on our landscape. Your expertise is definitely appreciated, and maybe we can have you on again soon.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Colin.
Thanks.